Press review time. Solange is with us here on set. She's starting off on the first day of the trial on the November 13th. Terrorist attacks, of course, that we've been covering here on France 24. What about the French press? How are they covering it, Solange?
Well, it was a testimony that turned the room's blood cold. That is how Le Parisien is calling the testimony of Salah Abdeslam to the courtroom yesterday. And notably, his reaffirmation when he was asked what his job is, what his profession is, he said that his job is being an Islamic State group fighter. Now, the French Daily called this stance a provocation, and that is exactly what the Belgian paper Le Soir called it as well. The paper says that the Belgian-born national and sole surviving jihadist of the 2015 attacks complained, quote, of being treated like a dog. Now, with Abdeslam maintaining that he only answers to his god, the cartoonist Chapat, he took on a satirical take and he had him drawn, saying to a blindfolded lady justice, quote, "I don't speak to women."
Afghanistan next. Women there coming out to protest the composition of the all-male Taliban government.
Yeah, and those protests, they were met by women, were met with a violent crackdown by the Taliban. The National tells us several women were struck with whips as the crowd was violently dispersed. And Le Figaro's correspondent in Kabul explains that the Taliban is steadily imposing its strict restrictions on Sharia law, its strict vision of Sharia law, with no more sports for women, no fashion boutiques, no barbers, no non-religious music, films, or videos, and in often cases, no education as well. So, for the Washington Post, the Taliban's promise of a more inclusive, open regime has gone up in smoke. But the Taliban has kept one promise, according to the paper. They say that the group won't even try to keep up the pretense of a democracy.
And talking of democracy building and its pitfalls, that's also being discussed in the American press as it reflects both on 9/11 and the US's 20-year war in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and for Chapat, there are parallels, literal ones, to be drawn between the two events. For it was planes going into the Twin Towers that began the Afghanistan war, and now 2 decades later, it is other planes that have pulled out. Planes going in, planes coming out, and the Taliban coming back again into power. Many American commentators, well, they're saying that the U.S. is back at square one, but perhaps not, according to Vox. The site argues that 9/11 was a sharp turn in the road for American foreign policy, one that propped up multiple, as we know, interventions abroad. But now, 2 decades later, the, quote, intellectual scaffolding holding up liberal interventionism, end quote, has taken a hit. And American foreign policy may now focus more on defending existing democracies than on creating new ones. That's according to Vox.
Now, some good, bad and ugly environmental news that Solange has pulled out for us.
Yeah, let's start with the bad, which is about the UK and its trade deal with Australia. The Independent tells us that an email has been leaked in which UK ministers agreed to cut their climate requests or compliance with the Paris Accords from their trade deal with Australia in order to, quote, get it over the line. Now let's move on to the good. Joe Biden's administration has laid out guidelines to boost solar power from 4 to 45%. Now, the New York Times calls this, quote, an ambitious blueprint, but it does issue a caveat, which is that it's not exactly clear to what extent the administration will push to get the trillions of dollars that will be needed to enact such change. Now, for the ugly, for little is uglier in the world than a clear-cut forest, and that's what environmental activists are trying to prevent from happening on Vancouver Island. The Guardian tells us that this is the biggest act of civil disobedience in Canada ever. For over 800 protesters have been arrested since April, trying to protect some of the last of the island's old-growth forests from, you guessed it, logging. Now, these protesters have been met with police violence, officers have been keeping their identities secret, and authorities have as well been barring the press from the areas, so that indeed is some ugly business.
A couple of articles about how we look at history.
Yeah, the American press is widely praising the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee in Virginia. For the cartoonist Michael de Adder, the Confederate general, has now been flushed down the loo. You see the loo there. You see history as well. Or rather, his so-called special place in history, which is the title of the cartoon, must now come with an asterisk. You see an asterisk there as well. One that states that Lee was indeed a racist, slave-owning insurrectionist. Now, this notion of needing to change how we educate and how we teach history and adding better context to it is also popping up in the Canadian press. This in regard to another asterisk. You see him there, the cartoon character. Now, Radio Canada explains that some 5,000 books, including comics of Tintin and Asterix, were destroyed because of their racist depictions of Native peoples. But here, the move by an Ontario school district has created much backlash, with many saying burning books is never the answer, but rather adding historical context or an asterisk would have sufficed.
And finally, Solange is completing all our lives today by answering the most important question, one that I'm sure has been pressing in your mind. Why are Superman's undergarments on the outside?
It is not because Clark Kent made a fashion faux pas, but rather Slate tells us that Superman has his red undies on the outside because, well, at the time that was the fashion in the 1930s. Hulky circus barbell men with undies on were all the rage. And the other answer, too, interestingly enough, is because of printing presses. The vivid red tighty-whities, well, they help the printing presses sort of highlight his prowesses down there.
Solange used that phrase earlier on, and I'm going to have to draw attention to it again.
I couldn't resist. Prowess down there, just it rings well.
Prowess down there. Solange's phrase of the day on France 24. Thanks a lot. Solange with the papers, and Stephen just a few moments ago with business as well. Next off, though, Focus. We're going to be reporting on how with the regulation of the collection of red coral off the seabed of Sardinia, instead, counterfeiters are stepping in, making and selling products which are just not the real thing. That's our Focus report in the next half hour.